Welcome back. This is part 4 of Knowledge Targeting, the 50-part documentary series from TI One Voice, and it is called David Lawson's Landmark Investigation, Cause Stalking in America. The first 3 episodes were built on the testimony of targets. This one turns to an outsider, a private investigator who took a routine stalking referral in the early 1990s and spent the next 12 years inside the network he stumbled into. That line comes from the chapter this episode follows, and it sets the discipline for the next 2 hours. Lawson observed. Lawson also explained what he observed. Eleanor White, whose field guide carried his findings out to the targeted individual community, treated those two things very differently, confirming a great deal of what he saw, disputing a good deal of what he concluded, and refusing on principle to let the two blur together. Knowledge targeting gathers, in one place, what the targeted individual community has managed to establish about its own situation. 50 episodes, about 2 hours each, drawn from a book of that name and from an indexed archive of thousands of documents. Some of that archive is declassified file and court record. Some of it is testimony nobody has ever tested. The series works hard not to blur the two, and says so plainly when it cannot tell them apart. This is part 4 of 50 and the 4th episode of section 1, the 10-part stretch that defines the phenomenon before any technology is discussed. The episodes are built to stand alone, so nothing here assumes you watched the first 3. What helps is knowing the shape of the argument so far. 3 episodes of pattern, taxonomy, and motive, assembled almost entirely from the accounts of the people living inside it. Part 3 was called The Why You Question, and it ended without an answer, 6 traceable routes into target status and 7 targets in 10 who fit none of them. This episode changes the witness rather than the question. And Part 5, Statistical Dimensions of Organized Stalking, will take the step after that, asking what happens when you try to count a population no official body has ever agreed to define. A word about where this series comes from. TI One Voice is a documentation platform built by targets for targets. There is an evidence library where an incident can be recorded with its date, time, location, and attachments, and kept. There is a knowledge base of thousands of indexed documents, searched by meaning rather than by keyword. And there is a community wall with secure messaging in dozens of languages. Joining costs nothing. The address is tionyvoice.org. There is also TI-TV, the community's own channel, streaming 24 hours a day, every day of the week, documentaries, interviews, recorded talks, and this series in full, with no account and no payment required. You will find it at meet.witisk.org, under Public, then TI-TV. Every episode also exists as a written article, with its sources listed line by line, for anyone who would rather read. It is fair to ask how a script like this gets put together. Chapter 4 supplies the spine. Each section of it is then put as a question to the TI One Voice knowledge base, and whatever comes back, wiki entries, court records, community reports, scan books, is read against the chapter and worked into the narration. Nothing is written from memory. Where a claim appears, the document behind it can be named. For rules govern this series, and this episode leans on them harder than most, because its central figure is a single self-published source. Documented fact and contested claim stay visibly apart. No private individual is ever named as a perpetrator. Quotes stay short and carry their attribution in the same breath. And where the evidence stops, the narration says so, instead of smoothing the gap over with confident language. Rule 4 will do the most work today. One thing before we begin, for anyone watching who recognizes this from the inside. Much of what follows is a stranger describing, from the outside, behavior you may have spent years trying to get somebody to believe. That can land as relief and it can land hard. Go at your own pace. The episode will still be here. Nothing in it is a diagnosis, and nothing in it is advice about your situation. Here is the road ahead. First, the investigator himself and how a routine referral stopped behaving like one. Second, the radio scanner that opened the network to him. Third, 12 years of gaining confidence inside it. Fourth, what he actually observed, and the hard line between that and what he concluded. Then the limits of a single self-published source, and the East German precedent that keeps being invoked alongside it. So, the chapter proper. Its first section is called The Investigator Who Went Inside, and it does something the previous 3 chapters could not. It changes the category of evidence. Until now, the record has rested on targets describing their own lives, indispensable but always open to the objection that the witness is also the subject. Here the witness is a professional outsider with no stake in the community's account of itself. Who was he? Less is documented than you might expect. By his own account, a former police officer who moved into private investigation, based in Florida. He does not say which department he served with, for how long or at what rank. The TI-1 voice knowledge base records exactly the same gaps. No early life, no personal life, no documented current whereabouts. What survives is the work rather than the man. Now the case that changed everything. A client reported being followed, watched and harassed. Lawsons set up surveillance to confirm or refute it, and what came back did not fit the template. There was not one person following the client. There were several, and the faces changed from day to day while the behavior did not. The same watching, the same too frequent appearances, produced by different individuals apparently working in shifts. A single stalker, however obsessed, gives himself away by repeating. The same face, the same car, the same pattern of contact. Repetition is what makes conventional stalking provable in the first place. Strip the repetition out by rotating the personnel, and the behavior survives while the evidence quietly disappears. That is the structural point this whole episode turns on, and it explains a great deal about why complaints of this kind go nowhere. A competent investigator faced with that has 2 options. Close the file as inconclusive or widen it. Lawson widened it. He wanted the scope, who was involved, how they coordinated, whether there was a central organizer or something more distributed. So he kept working with the only tools a private investigator has: observation, documentation, cross-referencing, and the slow assembly of a pattern out of fragments. Weeks became months. Months became years. 12 years. 3 jurisdictions, New York State, Florida, and Canada. 2 published books. That is what the file eventually consumed. More than a decade of sustained fieldwork by one professional, working largely without institutional support, without funding, and without any of the protections a formal research program would have carried. The TI-1 voice knowledge base describes the same span as roughly 12 years, conducted, it notes carefully, on a part-time basis. The published record is thin but datable. Terrorist Stalking in America appeared in 2001. An expanded, revised edition, retitled Cause Stalking, followed in 2007. The knowledge base carries both titles and notes, honestly, that the exact date of the retitling is not documented anywhere it can find. Both books were self-published, a real limitation, and one this episode will return to rather than skate past. What separates this account from most testimony is not the claim but the method behind it. A private investigator's professional currency is corroboration. An observation that cannot be checked against something independent is worth very little in that trade. Lawson appears to have held his findings to that standard rather than relaxing it because the subject was strange. Every observation dated, every observation timed, every observation cross-referenced against whatever else was happening. Nothing counted as significant until it repeated. The same vehicle at the same hour on separate days. The same voice on the scanner matching the same activity in the street. That is not peer review, and this episode will not pretend otherwise, but it sits a long way above uncorroborated testimony. And that scanner now deserves its own attention, because a piece of ordinary radio equipment is what opened the door. That discipline, dated, timed, cross-referenced, is what makes the next part of the story more than an anecdote. Because the discovery that reshaped Lawsons' investigation did not come from a tip. It did not come from a witness, an interview, or a confession. It came from a radio. And it came from a radio because he happened to be listening to one for routine reasons on an ordinary day in what was still an ordinary case. The device was a public service scanner, consumer grade, the kind sold in electronics shops and used for decades by hobbyists, journalists, and private investigators. It sweeps the frequencies that police, fire crews, utility teams, and taxi dispatchers use, and it stops wherever it finds traffic. Nothing about it is exotic or restricted. Lawson kept one running in the background of his surveillance work, half listening, the way an investigator keeps a police band on in the car. Consider what that means for the shape of the evidence. Everything Lawson had gathered so far, he had gathered with his eyes, in places and at times he had chosen. The scanner was different. It was a channel he was not pointing at anything. It could not be shaped by his client's expectations, and it had no interest in what he believed. The break in the case came from a machine whose only function was to listen. After a while, he began to notice traffic that did not fit the ordinary rhythm of the bands. The same voices returned, identifiable by speech pattern rather than by name, and they returned at the same points in what looked like a shift schedule. The content was operational rather than social, short, functional exchanges about locations, movements, and sightings. And the timing kept lining up with what he was separately watching out on the street. A burst of chatter, then, within minutes, a vehicle on a street with no obvious reason to be there. Another burst, then a small group gathering near a location he had under observation. Lawson was careful here, and this account will be careful too. Radio bands carry every kind of unrelated conversation, and any single instance could be coincidence. What mattered was repetition. Across enough instances, coincidence stops being the simplest available explanation. Then came the moment that changed the meaning of everything he was hearing. The chatter was not following the events he observed. It was preceding them. Transmissions came before the vehicle appeared, before the group assembled, before the target's routine was disrupted. Traffic that reliably arrives first is not commentary on events. It is the instruction that produces them. That is the whole distance between noise on a band and operational coordination. Up to that point, Lawson's evidence had a single source, what he could see from a surveillance position, checked against what his client reported. Observation alone is thin. An observer can misread a scene, can be primed by the person paying him, can find the very pattern he went looking for. The scanner gave him a second channel, gathered through a different sense, which could be tested against the first rather than merely repeating it. And when the two channels converged, the convergence carried weight that neither carried alone. A transmission about a vehicle movement, followed by the movement of a vehicle. A transmission about a location, followed by watchers at that location. Two independent streams agreeing is not proof of who stood behind them, but it is evidence that the coordination itself was real, not an artifact of expectation, and not the product of a suggestible client. Eleanor White, who folded these findings into her own field guide, put the tension plainly. Her sentence does two jobs at once. It credits the fieldwork because no outsider has produced anything comparable before or since. And it refuses to let the fieldwork carry the author's conclusions on its back. White's rule, which this series follows, is that observation and interpretation travel in separate compartments, and a reader is entitled to accept one without the other. It is worth being precise about what the scanner changed, because the distinction reaches far beyond this one case. Uncorroborated testimony offers a single stream, from an interested party, about events that are individually deniable. Corroborated observation offers two or more streams, from different sources or different senses, which can be checked against each other. Same events, entirely different evidentiary status. The organized stalking literature has struggled with exactly that gap for 30 years. The knowledge base shows the same logic in a modern form. The TI-1 voice evidence work rates each documented incident on a 0 to 10 scale, weighting corroboration density, completeness, how quickly the report followed the event, and how well it cross-references other records. Those 4 terms describe almost exactly what the scanner supplied. The knowledge base is equally blunt about the alternative. A personal incident log, kept alone and unverified, carries no recognized evidentiary standing in a court. There is a second finding hidden inside the first, and it points somewhere unexpected. The groups Lawson monitored were coordinating over unencrypted, publicly accessible frequencies, public service bands and citizen band channels that anyone with a cheap receiver could hear. They were not scrambling their traffic. They were not using a cipher an outsider could not follow. Nobody was hiding the signal, apparently because nobody expected that anyone would ever be listening to it. Follow that where it leads. A state-level intelligence service running a covert harassment program does not coordinate over open civilian airwaves that a hobbyist can monitor from a parked car. Communications security is the first thing such an organization buys. A loose network of self-appointed volunteers, using the equipment available at any electronics counter, very well might. The method of communication is itself a piece of evidence about the shape of the organization. So the scanner narrows the field without naming anybody in it. It makes a centrally controlled, professionally run program less likely as an explanation of the network Lawson personally observed, and a distributed bottom-up structure more likely. That is a constraint, not a conclusion. It applies to what one investigator found across 3 jurisdictions over 12 years. Whether it generalizes to every case is a question this chapter will keep open rather than quietly close. The caution cuts both ways, and the knowledge base is useful here. Documented state programs do exist. The 1971 burglary of a small FBI office in Media, Pennsylvania exposed covert monitoring of lawful political activity, and congressional disclosure of Operation Minaret 4 years later confirmed warrantless watchlisting of Americans for their politics. Precedent for covert harassment is real and on the record. What precedent cannot do is tell us who was on Lawson's frequencies. The last thing the airwaves gave him was a vocabulary. Lawson describes recurring, dispatch-style language over the monitored frequencies, shorthand for shifts, sightings, and movements. Here the evidence thins, and we should say so plainly. His raw field notes have never been published, and his books summarize the content of the radio traffic rather than reproducing it. What follows are functional categories drawn from those summaries, not verbatim quotations that anyone can now check. Even so, the specific words matter less than the fact that any words existed. A group does not develop shorthand for coordinating convoys, managing shifts, designating a target, and standing down unless it is, in fact, coordinating convoys and managing shifts. Jargon is a byproduct of organization. It appears because people who work together repeatedly need to say the same things quickly. Its existence is evidence of the thing it names. And the function that vocabulary served points to something about the people who were using it. White's summary of Lawson's findings notes that the group he watched had adopted an identity for itself, a kind of self-appointed community police force, doing what it believed the real authorities could not or would not do. That belief is the hinge of this whole chapter. People do not run shifts against a neighbor for nothing. They run them for a story. Before we go further, the ledger of limits. Lawson's field notes are not public, so the radio evidence cannot be independently re-examined today. Both books were self-published, without peer review or outside editorial scrutiny. Everything here comes from one investigator, and a single source stays a single source, however disciplined the method. None of that makes the account false. It does mean the honest phrase is documented by Lawson, rather than simply documented. So what a radio could prove is that the coordination was real. What a radio cannot do is tell you who these people think they are, how they were recruited, what they are told about the person they are watching, or why they keep turning up for a shift. For that, Lawson needed something no receiver will ever pick up. He needed to be let in. And that is where the next stretch of this investigation begins. The scanner settled one question and immediately raised another. Radio traffic proved that the movements were coordinated. It could not tell Lawson who recruited whom, what new members were told, or what the participants believed they were doing. A receiver gives you the outside of an operation. Lawson wanted the inside, and the only thing that buys the inside of a closed group is not equipment. It is trust, and trust takes years. What followed was not an operation of weeks but of years. Across roughly 12 years, working with a Florida-based detective agency and traveling through the United States and Canada, Lawson gradually embedded himself in the groups he had been monitoring. The knowledge base entry on Lawson describes exactly that. An investigator whose undercover research ran for about 12 years across 2 countries. Nothing comparable existed then, and nothing comparable has appeared since. The embedding was incremental. Lawson did not invent a false name or a fabricated life. He presented himself accurately, if incompletely, as a man interested in community safety, someone who had noticed things on his own street and was willing to help watch a situation that others had already flagged. The persona was a real part of his professional identity, selectively shown. The part he withheld was that he intended, eventually, to publish. That withholding is deception, and this series will not dress it up as anything else. Lawson misled people in order to record what they did when they believed no outsider was present. Eleanor White, who leans on his findings throughout her book, is blunt about their limits. She writes that his investigation is a godsend for targets, but that there are, frankly, some problems with his books. Both of those things are true. Whether that deception was justified is a question reasonable people answer differently, and this program does not pretend to settle it. What is not in dispute is narrower and more uncomfortable. No comparable investigation has been carried out before or since. Lawson's raw field notes have never been published. So the single richest account of how these groups work from the inside is also an account nobody else has been able to check. Trust is built slowly and destroyed quickly, so Lawson worked at the group's tempo rather than his own. He turned up consistently. He asked the questions a cooperative participant would ask, and stopped short of the ones that would have marked him as an outsider. He let members explain their work in their own words. And he never argued with the group's picture of itself, however wide the gap between that picture and its behavior. That self-image matters, because it is the engine of everything that follows. Eleanor White, summarizing Lawson's findings, records that the group he joined saw itself as a kind of unofficial community police force. Not vigilantes, not harassers, helpers doing work the authorities supposedly could not do. An adversarial investigator who challenged that story on day one would have learned nothing at all. Lawson accepted the framing, and the framing let him in. So how does an ordinary neighbor end up inside a network like this? Almost never dramatically, Lawson found. Nobody is asked on the first day to harass a stranger. Participation arrives dressed as neighborhood vigilance. A complaint about someone nearby, a rumor already circulating, an appeal to keep the block safe, an invitation to keep an eye on a situation that other people have quietly judged already. It sounds like community spirit. The pitch, as Lawson recorded it, has 3 standard parts. It appeals to civic duty, protecting the community, doing what the formal authorities apparently will not. It arrives through a trusted channel, a friend or a relative or a neighbor, so it rarely has to survive a stranger's scrutiny. And it begins with a small ask. Watch, note, mention what you see. Passive observation, not active involvement. That first step costs almost nothing. Lawson's explanation for why the pitch works is not that recruits are stupid or unusually cruel. It is that the offer meets several ordinary human needs at once. Purpose, because you are protecting people. Belonging, because you are inside a group with a shared mission. Moral cover, because you have a clean story to tell yourself and anyone who asks. And structure, because somebody tells you where to be. Powerful goods, cheaply obtained. Then the escalation does the rest. Each step is small enough that no single moment feels like crossing a line. By the time the behavior would look, to any outsider, unambiguously like harassment, the participant has already spent months of time, social standing, and self-image on the group. Leaving now means conceding that everything before it was wrong. Staying is simply cheaper. That arithmetic, not fanaticism, is what holds the network together. None of this is unique to organized stalking, and Lawson never claimed that it was. The same latter is documented in cults, in criminal organizations, and in military units that drift into atrocity. Start small. Supply a story that makes participation feel decent. Escalate in increments. Bind people socially so that leaving costs more than staying. The knowledge base entry on Margaret Singer's Conditions for Thought Reform calls isolation a critical component of that process. Lawson's contribution, then, is not a new theory of human behavior. It is documentation. He recorded a well-known pattern of escalating group harm operating in one specific setting, community-based stalking networks, at a level of detail nobody else has matched. Keep the distinction clear. The general mechanism is established social science. The claim that it operates inside these particular groups rests on one investigator's account, and that account has never been independently replicated. Which brings us to structure, and to the part of Lawson's account that explains why these networks are so hard to hold to account. The groups he documented were not built like a corporation, a military unit, or an intelligence cell. They were looser than any of those, and the looseness is not sloppiness. It may be the most consequential feature of the entire design. It explains how they function and why accountability fails. 3 rough tiers, then. At the center, coordinators who plan the timing and assign the roles. Beneath them, watchers and drivers working shifts and seeing only their own fragment. At the edges, casual participants who drift in and out. Notice the word rough. This is not an organization chart that anyone produced. It is Lawson's reconstruction from inside the lower tiers, and he was candid that he never saw the whole of it. Coordinators were not, in Lawson's account, the ultimate authority. They behaved more like shift managers, responsible for a particular time window or a particular sector, holding a fuller picture than the people they directed, but plainly answerable to someone above them. Who that someone was, Lawson was never able to establish. He was inside the lower tiers, and the lower tiers are not told. Here, honestly, this is where the evidence simply runs out. Below the coordinators, the work is deliberately fragmented. A watcher assigned to one corner for one 3-hour window may never learn the scale of the operation, never meet the watchers on other corners at other hours, and never speak to the target at all. From inside that shift, the activity looks bounded and mild. Standing on a street, noting a car. It is vigilance, not harassment, as long as you only ever see your own slice. At the edges are the occasional helpers. Someone joins a single noise campaign because a neighbor asked. Someone drives a particular route because a friend suggested it. Many of them, Lawson believed, never understood that their small favors were components of a program. That is worth sitting with. A coordinated campaign does not require a crowd of committed persecutors. It mostly requires a great many people each doing one small, deniable thing. And there is no single figure at the top of the picture Lawson drew. Responsibility spreads sideways as much as it flows downward. That architecture protects itself. A flat, informal, shift-based network is far harder to prosecute than a hierarchy, far harder to pin a ringleader on, and far easier for any individual to minimize their own part in. If everyone sees only a fragment, nobody can be charged with the whole. Compare that with the historical record. In Socialist Workers' Party versus Attorney General, the knowledge base notes, a court could name an agency, subpoena its files, and establish a documented pattern of surveillance, infiltration, and sabotage. There was an institution to sue. A network of neighbors working shifts offers no such defendant. So what does that network actually do to a person? Next, the tactics themselves, beginning with the convoy. So the structure protects itself. Responsibility spreads sideways, no one holds the whole picture, and there is no ringleader to charge. But a structure on its own harms nobody. What turns an organizational chart into an ordeal is what the people inside it actually do, hour by hour on real streets. Lawson's most valuable contribution is not his theory about who runs these networks. It is his inventory of what he watched them do. Set his conclusions aside for a moment and something sturdier is left standing. Three things, really. The operational tactics he says he watched. The self-justifying psychology he heard participants use. And the informal process by which somebody became a target. Those are observations. Whether corporations paid the bills, whether a hidden authority ran the whole thing is inference, and we will weigh it separately. The observations are the harder claim to explain away. Start with the convoy because it is the tactic you could photograph. Several vehicles, each of them entirely unremarkable, appear near a person's home, or along a route they are known to drive, or at a place they are expected to arrive. The timing is the whole point. They come and go in sequence, and in the groups Lawson infiltrated, that sequence was managed over the same radio traffic he had spent months monitoring. On the air, he says, it sounds administrative. A voice gives a position. Another confirms a sighting. A third signals that it is time to move. Drivers who may never meet each other converge on one street within a few minutes, hold there long enough to be noticed, then peel away in different directions. No single driver does anything unlawful. The unlawfulness, if there is any, lives in the pattern rather than in any one car. Lawson understood the convoy as communication rather than injury. Nobody is struck. Nothing is stolen. The vehicles simply arrive, and the message they carry is unambiguous to the person standing in their own driveway. We see you. There are many of us. We know where you go. To everybody else on that street, it is traffic. For cars, on an ordinary evening, doing nothing at all that anyone would think to remember. Now imagine an officer stops one of those cars and asks the driver what they are doing here. The driver needs no airtight story. An errand. Commute. A friend 2 doors down. A wrong turn already corrected. The answer only has to be more plausible than the alternative, and the alternative is, I am part of a coordinated harassment convoy. In any single encounter, the ordinary explanation wins every time. That is the trap, and it closes cleanly. Coordination shows up only across days and weeks, in repetition. Same vehicles, same timing, same corner. The one person placed to see that repetition is the target. The authority who eventually hears about it is handed a single incident, on a single evening, and asked to find something sinister in 4 cars. He finds nothing because in that frame there is nothing to find. So the tactic is built to be reported. Built, more precisely, to be reported badly, forcing the target into a description that sounds unhinged the moment it leaves their mouth. That design feature does not prove the convoy exists. What it does explain is why, if convoys do exist, almost no complaint about one survives contact with a police report. A thin evidence trail is not evidence of absence, and not evidence of presence either. Tactics are one thing. What lifts Lawson's account above anecdote is a single short sentence in Eleanor White's summary of his work, and it is worth slowing right down for. She is not describing an atmosphere or a suspicion, or a pattern somebody thought they noticed. She is describing a finding, reached from the inside, over years, by an outsider whose profession was gathering evidence for people who intended to use it. Eleanor White writes of Lawson's years inside these groups that he found that they were, in fact, carrying out organized stalking on designated targets. 14 words, and every one of them is load-bearing. Read past it quickly and it sounds like a summary. Read it slowly and it is the claim skeptics of this subject usually insist can never be substantiated. Written by an author who is elsewhere openly critical of the man she quotes. Take it in pieces. In fact, signals direct observation, not something relayed by a third party. Designated target signals that specific people were chosen, tracked, and worked on, rather than a group behaving indiscriminately. Organized stalking signals the three-part definition this series set out in Part 1. Multiple participants, acting on information about a person they need not know, coordinated through a network. Each of those three phrases is doing its own separate work. Be precise about the reach of that finding. It does not tell us who ultimately directs the networks. It does not tell us why one person is designated and their neighbor is not. It does not tell us how widespread any of this is, or whether the groups are local and self-organizing or joined up across a country. What it does address is narrower than any of those, and considerably more important. The TI One Voice knowledge base entry on Lawson records the outline. A private investigator based in Florida, who spent roughly 12 years working with a detective agency and traveling across the United States and Canada, and whose books gave this community the phrase cause stalking. The same entry notes that he alleged the harassment was often carried out on behalf of corporate or other interests. That allegation is his. It is not documented. Which brings us to the strangest thing he reports, and the phrase everybody remembers. Special Community Police. Nobody deputized these people. There was no badge, no warrant, no complaints procedure, no oversight, no legal standing of any kind. And yet, from the inside, Lawson describes members who appeared genuinely to believe they were performing a protective function for their neighborhood. Not harassers, enforcers, not persecuting the innocent, keeping everybody else safe. Every closed group needs answers ready for the moment a member hesitates, and Lawson describes a set of them in constant circulation. Why am I doing this? The community needs protecting. What if this person has done nothing wrong? Nobody mobilizes for no reason, so there must be something. Should I stop? Stopping means abandoning the neighborhood. Note carefully that this is his reading of their psychology, from the inside, not a measured finding. So how does somebody get designated? Lawson's answer is the part that unsettles people most, because it is so ordinary. It begins with a rumor, complaint, a grievance, not evidence, not a formal accusation, nothing that has been tested by any process at all. Somebody voices a suspicion, and that suspicion travels by word of mouth far faster than the person it concerns ever hears they are being discussed. Then a file grows, habits noted, routes recorded, associations mapped. Not a police file because it has no evidentiary standard, no oversight and no way to correct an error, but shaped like one. Whether such dossiers can exist is not in dispute. The knowledge base holds documented cases. A counterintelligence program from 1956, stolen files that exposed it in 1971, Senate hearings, and a federal court ruling in 1986. And here is the feature that separates all of this from a real investigation. Police inquiry ends. Charges are filed or dropped. A report gets written, a verdict returned, and the person either faces consequences or walks out cleared. The case against a designated target has no ending at all. No charge is ever laid, so no charge can ever be answered. No hearing, no verdict, and therefore no possible acquittal. You cannot clear a name against an accusation nobody ever made. The suspicion simply continues, indefinitely, with no termination condition and no appeal. The knowledge-based material on the psychology of targeting describes what that does to a person. Friends and colleagues who cannot follow the story drift away, and the isolation deepens the longer it runs. White treats the missing exit as the most corrosive feature of everything Lawson documented. Hold all of that steadily, because the next question is the sharpest one in this chapter. We have been moving between two very different kinds of statement. What Lawson says he watched with his own eyes, and what Lawson concluded about who was behind it. Eleanor White insists that those two be judged entirely separately, and she is unusually hard on the second. Where exactly she draws that line comes next. That absence of an exit is where the previous section left the target, under a suspicion that can never be lifted, in a case that can never be closed. Now we turn from what Lawson found to how Eleanor White reads him. Her most important contribution to this chapter is not a new fact about stalking groups. It is a rule for handling evidence, and it is the hinge the whole chapter turns on. White draws a hard line between what Lawson observed and what Lawson concluded, and she insists the two be weighed separately. It sounds like a small housekeeping distinction. It is not. Almost every argument about organized stalking, for it and against it, goes wrong at exactly this point. So before we test a single one of Lawson's claims, we have to be clear about which kind of claim we are testing. On the observation side, White's verdict is blunt. The match is, in her word, perfect. Convoys of vehicles, watchers posted on foot, handheld radios coordinating movements in real time, encounters staged so that the target sees them clearly and a bystander sees nothing worth reporting. Lawson describes all of this from inside the groups. Targets describe it from the receiving end. In their essentials, the two descriptions are the same description. The organizational picture matches too. Lawson found loose, shift-based groups with coordinators directing participants who each see only a fragment of the operation. That detail quietly resolves something that always looked paradoxical in target testimony. The harassment feels tightly coordinated, and yet no single participant ever seems to be in charge or to know the whole plan. Both of those things can be true at once, if the structure is deliberately fragmented. So hold the two columns apart. On one side sit the observations, the tactics, the shift patterns, the radios, the self-image of the people doing it. On the other sit the conclusions, who gets targeted, why they were chosen, and how far these networks actually reach. The first column is what a trained investigator watched happen over years. The second is what he thought it meant. They do not carry equal weight. The strangest convergence of all is about self-image. Lawson found groups that saw themselves as performing a protective policing function, not a campaign of harassment. Targets independently report the same thing. Participants who seem genuinely baffled when challenged that anybody would call their behavior wrong. Two sources, with no contact between them, describing the same moral posture. That is not the kind of detail a shared rumor usually manages to produce. White is precise about how much weight Lawson can bear. In her own guidance on handling information held in the knowledge base, she writes that quotes from Lawson are probably not courtroom quality proof, but that in her experience they are excellent when dealing with the public. That is an unusually honest sentence from an advocate. It concedes the legal ceiling of the material in the same breath as it defends the explanatory value. Some plain facts from the knowledge base entry on Lawson. The investigation ran roughly 12 years part-time across parts of the United States and Canada. It produced a book, published in 2001 as Terrorist Stalking in America and later retitled Cause Stalking. The knowledge base notes that the date of the retitling is not documented. 12 years of fieldwork, 1 volume, and no comparable study by anyone since. Why should convergence count as evidence at all? Because independent sources very rarely invent the same details. But there is a caution here, and the knowledge base itself supplies it. A corpus analysis of Target's own documentation found large clusters of near-identical reports, because people were filling in the same shared template. Where accounts converge through a common form, the convergence proves less. Lawson's real value is that he stood entirely outside that loop. Now the other column. Lawson argued that targets are chosen for a reason. A grievance, an alleged transgression, some locally circulated suspicion that the group treats as justification for its attention. That is where his preferred term comes from. The knowledge base records that Lawson coined cause stalking to mark harassment driven by a political or social cause, rather than by the personal obsession that ordinary stalking law was actually written to address. The theory does fit a real subset of cases. Whistleblowers, witnesses, people who can name an enemy or point at the week it started. Part 3 of this series cataloged 6 such doors into targeting. But roughly 7 in 10 of the targets in White's material report nothing of that kind. No known enemy, no grievance, no moment where the thing began. A theory built on cause has to explain them, and it does not. It is worth being concrete about where the framework does work. The chapter points to people who can name a precipitating event. A complaint filed, testimony given, a workplace dispute that escalated, a private conflict that spilled into public, a visible political profile, a local suspicion that hardened into consensus. Where one of those exists, Lawson's model has something to grip. Where none of them exists, it has nothing to grip at all. The theory can be rescued, of course. You simply say that a cause exists but the target does not know what it is. Hold that sentence up to the light, though. A cause nobody can identify, produced by nobody who will name it, is in evidentiary terms indistinguishable from no cause whatsoever. It explains everything, which means it predicts nothing. A claim that cannot possibly fail is not a finding. There is a second gap, and it is the larger of the two. Lawson's model is local. Neighborhood groups, workplace circles, communities mobilized against somebody in their midst. But targets very frequently report that the harassment follows them to another city, another state, in some accounts another country. A self-organizing local group does not obviously reach that far. Something or someone has to carry the file from one town to the next. Lawson does not answer that question, and White does not answer it for him. She names the gap and leaves it open, which is the honest thing to do. It remains one of the major unresolved issues in this literature. Part 8 will come back to it, because whether local groups are connected to something larger is exactly the question the available evidence does not settle in either direction. Here the evidence runs out. What can be said is that coordinated harassment of civilians by an institution is not a hypothetical. The knowledge base documents several instances. 1956 saw the beginning of the FBI's domestic counterintelligence program. In 1971, activists burgled a bureau office in Media, Pennsylvania, and published what they took. Those are findings of record. They establish that this pattern is possible. They do not establish that it is happening here. Set them side by side. 1956. A domestic counterintelligence program begins. 1971. Stolen files expose it. 1975. Senate investigators disclose a National Security Agency watch list that monitored Americans for their politics. 1986. A federal court finds against the government in the Socialist Workers' Party case over surveillance, infiltration, and sabotage conducted without evidence of any crime. 2001, Lawson publishes. For our findings of record, the fifth is not. So what did those 12 years actually change? The knowledge base is blunt about it. No documented legal or policy changes resulted directly from Lawson's investigation. Organized stalking remains largely unrecognized by law enforcement, and people who report it still meet skepticism. The concept has surfaced in discussions of domestic terrorism, which is something. But a landmark investigation that moves no statute is a landmark with no road running past it. Both sides of this argument tend to collapse White's distinction in opposite directions. Supporters cite Lawson's observations as proof. then quietly import his conclusions as though those were equally established. Skeptics do the reverse. They find the conclusions incomplete and throw the observations out along with them. Each move is a mistake and each does real damage. One builds on a foundation that will not hold. The other discards the strongest evidence the field has. The disciplined position is unglamorous, and it is the one this series takes. Lawson's observations are confirmed by independent convergence, and they should be trusted. His conclusions are hypotheses, useful, testable, unsettled, and they should be labeled as such every single time they are used. Kept apart, Lawson remains the strongest outside evidence this field has. Which raises the obvious question. What does it mean that nobody has ever repeated him? Hold those two things apart, as White insists, and a harder question arrives almost immediately. How much weight can one investigation carry? Everything the chapter has described so far, the convoys, the watchers, the radio traffic, the self-appointed community police, rests on the fieldwork of a single man. This next section is where the book turns that fact over and looks at it honestly, including the parts that are uncomfortable. As far as the present work has been able to establish, Lawson's investigation is the only published account of an undercover inquiry into organized stalking networks ever conducted by an outside professional. Notice the hedge in that sentence. The book does not claim no other investigation exists, only that none has been published and found. That single fact is simultaneously the investigation's greatest evidentiary contribution and its most serious limitation. Consider for a moment what the rest of the evidence base actually looks like. Target testimony, community documentation, advocacy writing, self-reported surveys. Nearly all of it is generated from inside the experience by the people living it, which is precisely the kind of evidence institutions discount fastest. Lawson's account differs in kind, not merely in degree. It is an outsider's record, built from inside the groups, and sustained across roughly 12 years. The distinction here is not about honesty. Targets are not less truthful than investigators, and nobody in this chapter suggests that they are. The distinction is about standing. A person describing what is happening to them has an obvious stake in being believed, and that stake, fairly or not, gets used to discount them. An investigator with no personal involvement, keeping dated files across a decade, is harder to dismiss. Not impossible. Harder. That sentence comes from Eleanor White, in the book that anchors this series and sits in the TI One Voice knowledge base. It is worth pausing on who is saying it. White is a target, an advocate, and the person with the most to gain from treating Lawson's work as unassailable. She says the opposite instead. The evidence is precious, and it has problems, and both of those are true at once. The knowledge base entry on Lawson describes a private investigator who worked with a Florida detective agency and traveled across the United States and Canada. Infiltrating groups he alleged were harassing civilians. Read the wider literature and the same pattern appears everywhere. When targets argue coordinated harassment is real, they cite him. When advocates argue the subject deserves investigation, they cite him. When researchers survey the field, they find testimony, then Lawson. Here is the number that ought to trouble everybody who uses this evidence. 0. In the quarter century since the first book appeared, no university researcher, no investigative journalist, no law enforcement agency, and no other private investigator has repeated the work or extended it. A phenomenon reported by thousands of people across several countries, sustained over decades, has produced exactly one undercover investigation. That is a comfortable fact for nobody. The chapter is very careful about how it reads that silence. The absence of a second investigation is not evidence that there was nothing to find. It is evidence about the barriers to looking. Those barriers are partly practical because embedding yourself inside a closed network is difficult, slow, and genuinely dangerous. but they are mostly institutional, and the institutional part is the part that could, in principle, be changed tomorrow. Funders, publishers, and professional bodies have all been reluctant to attach their names to a subject carrying the stigma of delusion. That reluctance is not a conspiracy, and the chapter does not present it as one. It is ordinary institutional risk aversion, and its practical effect is much the same as a ban. Lawsons' investigation exists, the argument runs, not because the infrastructure is strong, but because one determined individual did what institutions decline to. The knowledge base holds a modeling paper on exactly this problem, the Milestone Zero Addendum to the TI One Voice study. It argues that recognition must come before justice, and that recognition arrives through three separate doors: law enforcement, legislatures, and the medical and scientific community. Its projected dates are model outputs resting on assumptions about participation, and are not findings. But the structure is useful, and independent investigation helps open every door. Now the other side of the ledger. The chapter states its limits plainly, and it is worth understanding why that matters so much. Stating them is not a concession to skeptics. It is what makes the evidence usable. An advocate who oversells a single source hands the skeptic an easy victory. An advocate who names the weaknesses first cannot be ambushed by them later. So the book names 4 of them. For limits, and the chapter takes them strictly in order. The work was self-published. It rests on one investigator. The fieldwork is now decades old, and nobody has ever repeated it. None of those 4 amounts to a claim that Lawson was wrong about anything he saw. Each is a statement about how much certainty the evidence can bear. Take them one at a time because they do not all carry equal weight. Self-publication first, and the chapter is careful here. In a field mainstream publishers have avoided, self-publication may be the only route into circulation at all, and choosing it says nothing whatever about whether the contents are true. What it does mean is that no external editor, no fact-checker, and no peer reviewer ever tested the claims before they reached readers. The scrutiny that a formal publication process provides simply never happened here. Second on the list, the problem of the single investigator. A claim this consequential would ordinarily demand replication. Another trained person working separately, reaching the same conclusions. That has never been done. Which means the entire independent observation pillar of this evidence base rests on one set of files, one set of field notes, and one man's memory and documentation. The chapter calls that a genuinely fragile foundation, even when the documentation itself is sound. Third, and perhaps the most practically important, the fieldwork is dated. Lawson's active investigation ran largely through the 1990s. His first book appeared in 2001, the second in 2007. The groups he documented were products of a particular technological moment, and the very detail that first opened the door to him, open radio traffic anyone with a scanner could hear, belongs to that moment. A network operating now, if one is operating, would almost certainly use the same encrypted messaging that has become the default for coordination of every kind, lawful and unlawful. That matters twice over. It means Lawson's account is a baseline rather than a window, describing how such groups functioned at one historical moment. And it means the single method that made his investigation possible would very probably not work again. Fourth, and most fundamentally, the outside professional evidence for organized stalking reduces to a single data point. In criminology, in public health, in security studies, a reported phenomenon of this scale would long since have generated a substantial body of independent work. Here it has generated precisely one and then stopped. The honest response, the chapter argues, is not to discard that evidence but to demand far more of it, from institutions that have so far declined. It is worth being precise here about what was actually published, because the 2 books are often counted as 2 investigations. They are not. Cause Stalking, from 2007, is an expanded and revised edition of Terrorist Stalking in America, from 2001. The underlying fieldwork is identical. What changed between the editions was not the evidence itself but Lawson's own thinking about what that evidence meant. The titles themselves are unusually revealing. Terrorist stalking emphasizes severity and organization. Stalking carries a theory inside the phrase, the claim that targets are selected for a cause. That shift, from describing towards explaining, mirrors the whole arc of Lawson's engagement with the subject. Observation came first, explanation second, and the explanation always less settled than the observation. The word on the cover quietly records where his confidence had moved. 6 years apart, the two editions do offer one limited internal check. Had the operational detail changed between them, that would be a serious warning sign. As far as this book can determine, it did not. The theory developed and the emphasis moved, but the convoys, the watchers, the radio coordination, and the community police identity stayed put. So what does that record actually change for targets, for researchers, and for the law? So the two editions agree on what he saw, even where they disagree on what it meant. That stability earns Lawson a hearing. It does not settle the question. And so we arrive at the harder task of this chapter. Not to rule on David Lawson's work, but to say plainly what it changes. What does a single investigator's 12-year file actually alter for a target, for a researcher, and for the wider argument about recognition? The chapter is explicit about its own limits. It does not deliver a final verdict on Lawson's work, because the evidence for such a verdict would require independent replication, and no independent replication exists. What it does instead is place the work inside the broader organized stalking literature, pull out what is solidly confirmed, flag what remains contested, and mark the directions further investigation ought to take. That is a narrower claim and a more defensible one. Eleanor White, herself a target and the author of the booklet this series began with, put the tension in a single sentence in the knowledge base. She called the investigation a godsend, and in the same breath said there were frankly some problems with the books. Both halves of that sentence matter. Praise without the caveat becomes advocacy. The caveat without the praise throws away the only outside professional record the literature has. Hold the two columns apart and the record becomes usable. On one side sits what Lawson reported seeing over 12 years. Vehicle convoys, watchers in coordinated contact by radio, and groups that thought of themselves as a kind of unofficial community police. On the other sits what he concluded about why, the cause theory, the local vigilante structure, the sponsors behind it. The first column is testimony from a trained observer. The second is contestable interpretation. For an individual target, this is where the record does its most direct work. Shared testimony, however consistent, always meets the same objection. You are all describing the same thing because you all read the same forums. Lawson answers that objection from outside. A working investigator with professional training, no stake in being believed, and no membership in the target community went and looked, and reported finding the tactics that targets describe. The distinction has to be held tightly, because it is the point at which honest advocacy usually slips. Lawson's investigation confirmed an operational pattern. It did not confirm any particular person's case, and it could not, because he never examined those cases. What it does establish is that the pattern itself exists in the world and has been observed by an outsider. Describing that pattern is therefore not, by itself, a symptom of anything. There is a sentence the chapter offers to any target who has been told, by police, by doctors, by family, that what they describe cannot be happening. It runs. This is not only my account. This is what an outside professional, working independently, found when he looked. That sentence does not win an argument on its own. It moves the conversation from one person's credibility to a documented investigation, and that is a different conversation entirely. There is a second thing the chapter asks targets to carry, and it is gentler. Lawson's explanatory framework was never exhaustive. A target who cannot identify a cause, or whose harassment appears to follow them across states and across a national border in a way a purely local group could not manage, is not contradicted by his findings. Such a case simply falls into a class his framework never tried to account for. Cross-border continuity is worth pausing on, because it is exactly where the framework strains. A self-organized neighborhood group has no obvious mechanism for following someone into another state, let alone another country. Yet targets very commonly report that the pattern resumes after a move. The chapter does not resolve that. It flags it as a gap in the explanation rather than filling the gap with a bigger theory, and that restraint is itself the standard. Here is the arithmetic of the whole problem. 12 years of fieldwork. 1 investigator. 0 independent replications. The knowledge base entry on Lawson records a spare-time investigation carried out alongside agency work across the United States and Canada, and lists nothing comparable before or since. A single unreplicated source is a weak foundation in any evidentiary system. It is also, in this literature, the strongest single piece of outside evidence that exists. For researchers and advocates, the file offers a model and a challenge. The model is methodological, sustained observation over years rather than a weekend of interviews. Logs that are dated and cross-referenced so entries can be checked against one another later. Corroboration before conclusion, and a sharp line between what was seen and what was inferred. That is the ordinary working discipline of a trained investigator, and the field mostly does not meet it. The challenge, by contrast, is institutional rather than personal. Replication of a 12-year infiltration is not something a lone researcher can responsibly attempt. It needs universities with ethics review and funding, newsrooms with lawyers and source protection, oversight agencies with the power to compel documents. The chapter's charge is blunt. Lawson proved the investigation can be done. That nobody has done it since is a failure of the institutional response, not of his method. Set that model against the standard the field actually runs on. Most organized stalking research is built on uncorroborated testimony and self-report surveys. A knowledge-based analysis of the TI-1 voice document corpus found something sharper still. Among high-similarity document pairs, the dominant pattern was the same quick attack log template reused almost verbatim across different users. That is good for comparability. It is poor protection against the charge that accounts are shaped by shared sources. It is worth being concrete about what corroboration means, because the word gets used loosely. The knowledge base describes an evidence quality scoring model used in the TI-1 voice research program, which grades each submitted incident on a 0 to 10 scale. For things drive the score: how many independent sources touch the event, how complete the record is, how soon after the event it was logged, and how richly it cross-references other entries. And here the evidence runs out, so it should be said plainly. The knowledge base entry on the 1000 event memory log notes that such logs have no recognized evidentiary value in courts, and that critics see in them a risk of confirmation bias, with events cataloged because they already fit a belief. Some targets have tried to use them in litigation anyway. That limitation is precisely what an outside observer's record is meant to answer. Widen the lens one more time. For the broader project of making organized stalking legible to legislators, to police, to journalists, to clinicians, Lawson's file supplies a single piece of infrastructure that nothing else in the literature supplies. It is a documented, professional, outsider's confirmation that the core phenomenon is real. Every appeal for the subject to be taken seriously can anchor itself, at least partly, to that single fact, and most of them do. The knowledge base sets out what that anchor would have to be attached to. A TI-1 voice addendum called Milestone 0 argues that recognition must come before justice, and names 3 pillars: law enforcement, governments, and the medical and scientific community. Its model projects under a base case of 14,000 declarants by year 5, law enforcement recognition around early 2029, with government and medical acknowledgement following within a year. These are projections, not findings. There is a modern attempt to build at scale what Lawson built by hand. The knowledge base describes an initiative called SCORE, in which participants complete structured attack documentation interviews, and each submission is graded against that quality model. The stated projection is more than 1.4 million structured submissions from an estimated 14,000 active participants. Volume is not corroboration, but structure and scoring are at least the preconditions for corroboration to become possible. So the chapter closes its assessment by refusing to choose. The record is singular, incomplete, and unreplicated. It is also the most substantial piece of independent evidence the organized stalking literature possesses. Both statements are true, and the responsible stance holds both at once. Drop the first and you have advocacy dressed as scholarship. Drop the second and you have thrown away the only outside investigation anyone has bothered to conduct in a generation. That is the reckoning. But one feature of the file has gone almost unexamined in the secondary literature, and it bears directly on how far the local model can stretch. Lawson's fieldwork did not stay in one place. By his own account, it covered at least 3 jurisdictions: New York State, Florida, and Canada. The investigation followed the network across those boundaries. Where it went and what that implies comes next. So the record stands. Singular, incomplete, unreplicated, and still the strongest independent evidence this field possesses. Holding both halves of that sentence at once is the discipline the chapter asks for. Now we turn to a feature of Lawson's work that has been oddly underexamined, and that quietly constrains every argument about who is behind organized stalking. Not what he saw inside the groups, but where he saw it. The geography of the investigation. By Lawson's own account, the fieldwork covered at least 3 distinct jurisdictions: New York State, Florida, and Canada. He did not plan that itinerary in advance. He followed the network, and the network kept crossing lines on a map that a neighborhood grudge has no reason to cross. The knowledge base entry on terrorist stalking in America puts it plainly. The investigation covered both the United States and Canada, indicating groups that operated across international borders. The phases are only roughly datable from the published work. New York State appears to be the earliest, the period when he first identified the network and began to understand its structure. Florida came later, and became the base from which he eventually published his findings. Canada is referenced, but never detailed. That ordering is an inference drawn from the record, not a timeline Lawson supplied, and it should be held loosely by anyone who repeats it. What matters is not that he traveled. It is that the same things kept happening wherever he went. The same convoys of vehicles, the same watchers coordinating by radio, the same self-appointed community police identity, complete with borrowed police vocabulary. 3 jurisdictions, 1 operational grammar. That repetition is why Lawson concluded he was not documenting a single isolated group, but a network with at least a regional footprint, and quite possibly a wider one. New York State was a natural field of operations for a network of this kind. Its mix of dense urban corridors, commuter suburbs, and thin rural counties gives a mobile group cover in every register, and its northern edge runs along the Canadian border for hundreds of miles. Lawson describes residential, community-based operations, and the terrain he sketches, upstate towns and smaller cities and suburban streets, fits that description without strain. Eleanor White, who devoted a chapter of her own field guide to Lawson, drew the line this whole discussion depends on. She valued his observations. She held his conclusions firmly at arm's length. In her handbook Information Handling, held in the TI One Voice knowledge base, she adds a practical judgment worth carrying. Quotations from Lawson are probably not courtroom quality proof, but in her experience they work very well when you are talking to the public. Here the evidence thins, and we should say so. Lawson does not name specific locations with enough precision for anyone to map them, and no independent investigator has retraced his route. We can say 3 jurisdictions were involved. We cannot produce a single verified address, a dated log entry, or a corroborating witness from the published record. That is a real gap in the evidence, and no amount of pattern matching closes it. Florida was the later phase, and the base from which the findings were eventually published. The knowledge base records Lawson working for more than a decade with a Florida detective agency. Several features of the state suited a network of this kind: high population turnover, a large retired population with time to spare, and a dense culture of homeowner and neighborhood associations. Those are observations about opportunity, not proof of what occurred there. Florida is also where the method changed. He moved from listening at a distance to sitting at the table. Scanner traffic told him a group existed. Watching from outside told him how its crews moved. A restaurant where members ate their meals gave him an ordinary way in, and time gave him enough trust to be treated as an insider. By the end of that phase, he was describing internal dynamics from within. 12 years is the figure Lawson gives for the investigation, and Eleanor White adds a caveat worth keeping in view. It was likely a spare-time activity running alongside his paid casework. That does not diminish it. 12 years of intermittent, self-funded fieldwork across 3 jurisdictions is more sustained attention than any university, newspaper, or oversight body has given this subject before or since. It also explains the unevenness of what he brought back. An academic ethnographer would have published a timeline. Lawson did not. We do not know the date he crossed from observer to participant, how he managed the deception that undercover work demands, or what he did when a group's activity touched a real person. The knowledge base entry on him notes that his findings were presented as first-hand accounts rather than statistically validated data. That is a description of the record, not an accusation. Which brings us to the least documented and most suggestive element of the whole investigation: Canada. Lawson's published references to it are brief and nonspecific, enough to establish that Canadian fieldwork happened, nowhere near enough to reconstruct its scope or its duration. And yet the bare fact of it changes the shape of the argument, because a national border is not simply a line on a map. It is a change of legal universe. Cross a border and everything institutional changes. Different criminal statutes. Different police forces with no automatic duty to talk to one another. Different courts, different privacy law, different political culture. A group improvised by aggrieved neighbors has no mechanism for any of that. If the same operational pattern really did appear on both sides of the line, then something carried it there, and that something needs a name we do not yet have. The point can be put bluntly. A handful of aggrieved neighbors in one American city does not, on their own initiative, open a branch in another country. Either the network had formal organizational ties across the border, or its members belonged to some larger association that did, or the same methods were reinvented independently by groups working from a common playbook. All 3 remain possible. Lawson's published account does not let us choose between them. So the geography constrains the field of explanations without settling it. It rules out the smallest story, the purely local grudge, because a purely local grudge does not travel. What it leaves standing is a range of larger stories, and that range is uncomfortably wide. This is precisely the point where Lawson and Eleanor White parted company, and where the organized stalking literature has been stuck, more or less, ever since. Consider what still fits: a regional coordinating body, a shared training playbook passed between groups, a common funder, a franchised method that spreads the way any technique spreads with nobody at the center. An existing criminal network renting out its people. An ideological movement. A corporate client which is closest to Lawson's own reading. Or a state program. Cross-border operation is consistent with every one of those, which is exactly why it settles nothing alone. It is worth being precise about what scale does and does not prove. Criminal organizations operate across borders. So do extremist movements, so do advocacy networks, so do perfectly ordinary businesses. Multi-jurisdiction reach is evidence of organizational capacity, not of government involvement. Anyone who treats the Canadian connection as proof of a state program has skipped a step, and skipped steps are the first thing critics of this literature reach for. A modern echo of Lawson's geography sits in the TI One Voice knowledge base. Its aggregate analysis of 1,996 testimony documents counted 1,264 distinct geographic location descriptors, from major European capitals to towns in Kazakhstan, Nigeria, and Brazil. The report is careful about what that means. Free text descriptors are a proxy for places, not a verified count. Dispersion is documented. Coordination between those places is not. 25 years on, that sentence is the honest scoreboard. A trained investigator spent 12 years mapping a cross-border pattern and published it in 2001. No statute changed. The knowledge base records no testimony by him in any court or before any government body. Whatever the geography implies, it has never been tested by anyone holding a subpoena. Until it is, the question of attribution stays exactly where Lawson left it. Open. So the map tells us how large this thing was. It does not tell us who drew it. What the geography does give us is a second question, and it is the one Lawson was uniquely placed to answer. If a network reached across 3 jurisdictions, somebody had to staff it. Ordinary people had to say yes. Next we look at who those recruits were, and at what made them agree. The map told us how far this network reached. It did not tell us who was sitting in the cars. That is where the chapter turns next. Lawson spent those years inside the groups, and what he carried out was not only a diagram of methods and radio channels. It was also a portrait, mostly unspoken, of the ordinary person who agrees to follow a stranger for weeks and calls it community service. Caution before the portrait. The knowledge base entry on Lawson describes a private investigator who spent roughly 12 years infiltrating groups he alleged were harassing civilians across the United States and Canada. An investigator, then, and not a clinician, he offers no diagnostic categories, no formal psychological analysis, no sample and no control. What he offers is a pattern that recurs often enough across his account to be worth setting down and examining carefully. The first surprise is how unremarkable they were. Not extremists in the main and not obviously disturbed. Retirees with time on their hands. Parents at home who wanted something that felt like purpose. Younger adults brought in by an older relative who was already involved. People for whom the group supplied a kind of belonging that was otherwise missing from their lives. That is Lawson's characterization of the people he met, not a survey. Eleanor White valued Lawson's work enormously and still warned her readers about it. Her caution belongs on the record in her own words. Her objection was a specific one. Lawson tends to set down what he observed and what he personally concluded in the same breath, without marking the join. So we separate them here. Everything in this section is the first kind, the observation, handled with rather more care than he handled it. What Lawson describes is not a hunting party. The people he met were not, in the main, looking for somebody to hurt. They had been handed something first. A rumor, an accusation, a name attached to a wrongdoing both vague and serious. Then the activity was presented to them as protection. Watch this person. Keep the street safe. With that framing in place, nobody had to look squarely at what they were doing. This is the part that should unsettle you because it needs no monsters at all. Give an ordinary, decent, tax-paying adult an accusation and a protective frame, and you do not have to recruit malice. You need only to arrange things so that the malice never has to be admitted, or even noticed. Lawson's account, read carefully, is largely a description of that arrangement, assembled by people who thought they were helping. Laid out in order, the sequence is depressingly simple. An accusation arrives first, from a source most participants never examine. Recruitment follows, usually through somebody already known and trusted. The work is framed as neighborhood protection. Participation begins in small and individually deniable pieces. Then approval arrives from the others, which is the step that matters most. Notice that nowhere does the sequence require anybody to check whether the accusation was true. The language they used was borrowed wholesale from policing. Community police, keeping the neighborhood safe, doing what the real police cannot do. Eleanor White's summary records one group assuming the role of, in her phrase, some sort of special community police. Lawson's observation is that this was not merely a cover story for outsiders. The participants appeared to believe it, and saw themselves as an unofficial extension of law enforcement rather than as vigilantes. Which produces the paradox at the center of this section. These were people who paid their taxes, kept to the speed limit, and deferred politely to anybody in a uniform. That respect for authority is precisely what made them recruitable. The pitch never had to argue for breaking the law. It had to argue the exact opposite, and the chapter states the inversion plainly. Persuade them they are upholding it, and the rest follows. So consider what the recruiter actually had to supply, because it is far less than you would expect. A name carrying an accusation nobody would audit. A vocabulary that felt like a badge when you wore it. A routine with shifts and vehicles and a radio channel which gave the whole thing the texture of a real job. And a crowd that noticed when you failed to appear. No money, no ideology, no cruelty required. The second theme is the participants' relationship to evidence, and it is the bleakest part of the account. They did not, by and large, ask for proof. The accusation was sufficient on its own. Everything the target then did was read back through that filter. Staying home looked suspicious. Going out looked suspicious. Friendliness was a cover, and coldness was a confirmation. No behavior remained that would register to that audience as innocence. The loop closes on itself. An accusation lands and quietly becomes the lens. Ordinary behavior is then observed through it. The behavior is read as proof. The group agrees with the reading, and that agreement is far more persuasive than any private doubt a member might have entertained alone. Lawson's participants did not need to be gullible. They needed only to sit inside a group that interpreted every observation the same way together. Fairness requires a note here. This mechanism is not exotic and it is not unique to stalking groups. It is ordinary confirmation bias with social reinforcement bolted onto it. And it cuts both ways. The knowledge base entry on the 1000-event memory log records exactly this criticism aimed at targets themselves, that a log may catalog only the events which fit a belief already held. Neither observation settles anything. Both deserve stating. Here is Lawson's most important finding about the recruits, and it is easy to miss. They were not held there by belief. Most of them, on his account, were sustained by what participation paid out. Belonging, purpose, the approval of people whose approval they wanted. The sense of being inside something that mattered. The rumor was the entry ticket. The social rewards were the reason for staying, long after the ticket stopped meaning anything. Listen to the register because the register is the whole trick. The first four of these phrases come from Lawson's account and from Eleanor White's summary of it. The last two describe the tone rather than quoting it, and I flag that so you can weigh them properly. Every one of them performs the same job. It converts following a frightened stranger around a town into something a person can say aloud. Which explains why people stayed on long after the story had worn thin. Leaving is not free. Walk away and you lose the community that participation supplied, and stepping back reads to everybody else as an admission that the whole thing was wrong. The knowledge base entry on Singer's conditions for thought reform describes a group becoming a member's only source of validation. that literature concerns high control groups. Applying it here is analogy, not finding. You will recognize all of this from Part 3, which set out the theory. Conformity, peer approval, the pull of a group that is watching you. Measured in laboratories for 70 years. What Lawson adds is operational texture, the same dynamic observed in parked cars and living rooms rather than on a psychologist's clipboard. Convergence between a theory and a field account is encouraging. It is not corroboration. Both could be wrong together. 12 years buys something real. It buys patterns that no short study could ever see, and access no adversarial investigator could obtain. It does not buy a second observer. Nobody replicated this work. No clinician ever assessed the people described in it. No researcher has interviewed a participant under conditions that would let us test any of it. One account, one man, and no second look in the decades since. Let me mark plainly where the evidence stops. Nobody has ever asked a participant under research conditions why they took part. The knowledge base describes documentation programs projecting more than 1.4 million structured submissions from an estimated 14,000 targeted individuals. All of that effort sits on one side of the street. On the other side, where the watchers are, we hold a single investigator's notebook and nothing else. That asymmetry matters for what comes next. If the people doing this were ordinary, decent, law-abiding, persuaded rather than depraved, then the failure to stop them is not a failure of human nature. It is a failure of institutions, which raises the question the chapter turns to now. What do Lawson's findings actually demand of investigators, of prosecutors, and of laws that were written with a single stalker in mind? Start with what the investigation demonstrates about investigating. Lawson's 12 years were never only a documentation exercise. They were, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, an argument about what kind of response this phenomenon requires from the institutions that are supposed to protect citizens from crime. 3 questions follow from that, and this section takes them in order. Why these cases resist investigation, what the law already offers, and why the ordinary police response keeps failing. To the extent that a single source, self-published account can be said to have succeeded, Lawson succeeded because it combined 4 features. It was sustained, it was independent, it was covert, and it was technically enabled. Hold those 4 together because almost nothing else in this field has any of them, and no target of organized stalking has all 4. Take each in turn, and the shape of the investigative problem starts to appear. 12 years is an extraordinarily long period for any investigation, and the continuity is the point. It let Lawson establish patterns a shorter effort would simply have missed. Now compare that with how policing is actually organized. Shift changes, transfers, caseload targets, and a file that closes when the immediate complaint is resolved. The structure of ordinary investigation is almost designed to lose exactly the kind of pattern this phenomenon consists of. The second feature is the one this whole field most conspicuously lacks. Lawson entered without any prior belief about organized stalking, without a stake in what he found, and with professional habits of corroboration. Targets cannot be independent about their own case, and neither can the people advocating for them. One caution, though. Lawson's independence is his own account of himself. Nobody audited it at the time, and nobody has audited it since. Third, he embedded rather than confronting. An adversarial investigator knocking on doors collects denials, and denials from people who have rehearsed them. Lawson got the group's own account of itself, its internal logic, its recruitment process, its self-image. No investigator working from outside could have obtained that, and the cost belongs in the same sentence. That knowledge was produced by deception, which is why courts would treat it very differently from an interview. Fourth, it was technically enabled. An ordinary consumer scanner, pointed at an ordinary frequency, gave him an independent channel he could check against what he saw with his own eyes. That is the crucial asymmetry for anyone thinking about evidence. A target experiences the harassment but has no way of independently monitoring the coordination behind it. The cross-validation that makes Lawson's account weigh something is exactly the thing targets cannot perform. Which brings us to the central claim of this section. Any investigative approach that relies on incident-level responses, that treats a single complaint as a single case rather than a fragment of a pattern, and that evaluates the target's credibility rather than the network's activity will fail. Not because the investigators are incompetent, because the approach is mismatched to the phenomenon. That is a structural criticism, and structural criticisms are the fixable kind. Let me be careful here, because this is easily overstated. Those 4 features are not a recipe. Not every investigation can be a 12-year undercover operation, and nobody sensible is asking for one. What the features do is define the parameters of the problem. They tell us what kind of thing has to be investigated, and therefore which approaches have any chance of working against it, and which have none at all. So state the parameters plainly. This is a phenomenon that resists detection at the level of the individual incident. It protects itself through distributed architecture and deniable surface appearances. And it can only be understood by sustained observation from a vantage point that bridges 2 views: the target's accumulated experience over years, and the bystander's fragmentary glimpse of a single afternoon. Nothing in ordinary policing occupies that vantage point. Lawson built one. Those 3 habits are worth naming because targets meet them constantly. The community's own legal materials are unusually honest about it. The one-voice declaration guide tells signatories directly that filing does not automatically start an investigation, and does not guarantee that anyone will believe them. That is a support document warning its own users about institutional reality. It is also, read another way, a precise description of the failure mode Lawson's findings predict. Here is the strongest thing that can be built from Lawson's existence. His investigation proved, simply by happening, that the challenge can be met. A determined professional with limited resources and no institutional backing got inside a network and came back with an account. That this has happened exactly once by one person in 3 decades argues that the institutional response has been inadequate. Not that the phenomenon cannot be investigated. Which turns the argument from investigation towards law, and towards a sentence of whites that sounds almost mild. Anti-stalking laws, she writes, must finally be applied to organized stalking groups. Notice what she is not asking for. Not a new statute. Not a new offense. Not a new agency. Only that laws already sitting on the statute books be used against a category of conduct they plainly already cover. Hold on to that thought. So does existing law provide adequate tools? Following White's analysis, the answer is uncomfortable. The laws exist. They are simply not being applied. Following, watching, contacting, and intimidating are already criminal in most jurisdictions, under stalking, harassment, or anti-intimidation statutes. Which is why the one-voice declaration asks first for something that sounds merely procedural. Formal recognition by law enforcement that the person reporting is a crime victim at all. Recognition before remedy. The conduct is not lawful. Between it and a charge stand 3 obstacles. First, the distributed architecture. No participant can be charged with the whole campaign because none carried out the whole campaign. Second, the staging principle. Every visible act is dressed to look like ordinary life. Third, the standard of proof. A prosecutor must establish beyond reasonable doubt that one small act belonged to a coordinated campaign, and the coordination is what nobody ever witnessed. Picture the cross-examination. I was just driving down that street. I was just having a conversation on the pavement. I was just playing music in my car. Every one of those sentences is probably true of the individual act. Each is also, if Lawson is right, one shift on a rota. The staging principle is not a flourish. It is a defense strategy designed in advance of any charge, and on this evidence it works. The knowledge base describes a scoring model built for exactly this gap, weighting each account for corroboration density, completeness, how soon after the event it was recorded, and how richly it cross-references other testimony. That is the right instinct. But the same knowledge base records the hard limit beside it. Event logs on their own carry no recognized evidentiary value in court, however many of them exist, and however carefully they are kept. Underneath the three obstacles sits one mismatch. The law is built to prosecute individuals for specific acts. Organized stalking on Lawson's account is committed by networks through patterns. These are not incompatible in principle. A network can be charged as a conspiracy, and a pattern can be assembled from cumulative evidence. They are incompatible in current practice, which lacks the training, the resources, and the institutional will to investigate at the level of the group. And here is the result that ought to be studied more than it is. Lawson's investigation produced no prosecutions. None appear in his published work, and none in White's summary of it. He documented behavior that in aggregate was clearly criminal on any reasonable definition of harassment, and the documentation never became a charge. Not one. That is not a failure of evidence. It is a failure of fit between the crime and the machinery. There is a second door, and the knowledge base points to it. In the Socialist Workers' Party case against the Attorney General, a long-running covert program of surveillance, infiltration, and personal sabotage was established through the courts, not through a prosecution. It stands as proof that secret programs can be challenged. It is not a template here, for one plain reason. That case had a named defendant. Lawson's material has none. So White's proposal is modest and radical at once. Modest because it asks for no new law. Radical because moving an institution from we do not recognize this crime to we are actively prosecuting it is a far larger change than any legislative fix. Changing the law without changing the culture is necessary and insufficient. Which raises one final question. Has any institution ever run this playbook itself? One did, and it kept files. So the law sits unused, and the question hangs there. Could a campaign like the one Lawson described really be run, quietly, for years without collapsing under its own weight? There is one place where that question has already been answered, in writing by the people who did it. Not a theory, a filing system. Before we go further with Lawson, we need to go east to the German Democratic Republic. East Germany's Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, gave its campaign against dissidents a clinical name, Zersitzung. The word is borrowed from chemistry. It means decomposition or disintegration, the rotting of a thing from within. That is a description of intent, written down by the organization that intended it. Eleanor White raises it here as the second historical precedent, after COINTELPRO, and argues it sits closer to organized stalking than anything the Bureau ever ran. Understand first what the program was for. The ministry did not want these people in cells. An arrest was expensive. It was visible. It produced a trial, a date, a name that Western newspapers could print, and a dissident with a cause. Quiet ruin cost less and traveled nowhere. So the objective was not punishment through law. The objective was neutralization. Take away the credibility, the friends, the job, and finally the composure. Neutralization had 4 surfaces, and the files name them: credibility, social standing, professional life, psychological stability. Attack all 4 at once and the person remains free, employed by nobody, believed by nobody, and increasingly unsure of their own account of events. This was doctrine rather than improvisation. It was written into an internal ministry directive in 1976, taught to officers, applied through case files, and afterwards assessed by the ministry itself for effectiveness. Now, why can we speak about any of this with confidence? Because the paperwork survived. When the German Democratic Republic collapsed, its citizens occupied the ministry offices and stopped the shredding. A federal commissioner was appointed to hold the records and to open them, first to the people they were written about, then to historians. Almost everything we say about Zersitzung comes from the perpetrating agency's own files. That is a rare evidentiary position. Set the documented menu beside the one Lawson compiled after 12 years in the field, and the overlap is uncomfortable. Every item shares a design feature. Each act is small enough to be denied, ordinary enough to be explained, and useless as a police report on its own. The damage is cumulative and the deniability is per incident. That combination is not an accident. In the Stasi's case, it was the specification the tactics were built to meet. White calls it the lie campaign. A rumor seeded with neighbors, colleagues and family that the target is a criminal, a deviant, an addict. The Stasi files carry the same short list: thief, drunk, sexual deviant, informer for the West, and the same escalation, reaching for whichever accusation is most socially toxic when maximum damage is wanted. Lawson heard the recruiting version of it. The target has been identified as dangerous. The comparison is not ours alone. The knowledge base entry on East Germany records that movement documents make this claim directly, and treats the program as a documented historical case of state-sponsored organized stalking. It also flags something honest. Those excerpts name no individual East German victims. The program is documented, the individual cases in that source are not. Where a claim rests on a citation rather than a case file, we say so. Then there is the staging. A stranger repeats, in the street, a phrase you used at home. A picture hangs slightly crooked in a flat you locked. Your week fills with tiny reverses, each explainable, none reportable. The Stasi called this operational, and its purpose was to say without saying it that your privacy is gone. White calls the contemporary version street theater. Lawson watched crews rehearse and perform exactly that in ordinary suburbs. Hold the two side by side, though, because the differences matter as much as the echoes. One is a ministry with a budget, a directive, and an archive. The other is what a private investigator saw from inside neighborhood crews. No letterhead, no paper, no chain of command he could photograph. The tactics rhyme. The evidentiary situations do not. Zersitzung is proven history. What Lawson described is testimony from a single, careful, self-published observer. The third match is the one that does the most damage. Zersitzung ran through institutions. A word to an employer, a landlord, a university department, a housing committee, and the harm arrives wearing an official face, delivered by people who think they are acting on legitimate information. White documents the same shape at work and on campus. Lawson found groups that cultivated exactly those contacts, because a manager outperforms any number of followers. And the fourth match is the deepest because it is about purpose. Neither system is trying to convict anybody. White's phrase for the outcome is the ultimate punishment. A life dismantled without charge, without hearing, without appeal, and without any moment at which the accused gets to answer. The ministry chose that route deliberately, for reasons it wrote down. If the contemporary campaigns are real, the same due process void is doing the same work. It is worth measuring the two investigations against each other. The knowledge base records Lawson's fieldwork as roughly 12 years, part-time, unfunded, published in 2001, with no documented legal or policy change resulting from it. Against that stands a state archive opened by statute, worked over by historians for 3 decades. Same tactics, wildly different weight of proof. That asymmetry is not Lawson's failure. It is the ordinary condition of investigating a deniable crime. So what does the precedent actually establish? One thing, and it is not small. The tactical repertoire is not hypothetical. A state security service working at scale over decades built and used this exact menu, and then filed the paperwork. Nobody has to argue any more about whether human beings can be organized to do this to a neighbor. They were, and the records are public. The open question changes shape. Lay it out in order and the two stories almost touch. The Ministry for State Security was founded in 1950. The method was codified in the mid-70s and run until the state died. In November 1989, the wall came down. In 1991, a federal law opened the files. 10 years after that, a private investigator in North America published 12 years of notes describing something with a very familiar shape. The second thing the precedent settles is that the damage is predictable. The files describe a sequence, and it runs the same way each time. Trust goes first, then the friendships, then the job, then the person's confidence in their own perception. The knowledge-based material on coercive environments says the same. Isolation is the load-bearing element, because it removes every outside check on what is happening. This was the design, not a side effect. At the far end of the files are the cases that ended in breakdown, in forced relocation, and in suicide. Those outcomes were recorded by the agency as results. That is the hardest sentence in this section, and it needs saying plainly, because it disposes of a common objection. When someone under this kind of pressure becomes frightened, suspicious, and unwell, the symptoms are not evidence that nothing was happening. In the German case, they were the product. Now the limits, stated as plainly as White states them. This work does not claim that the Stasi still exists, that Zersitzung quietly continued after 1990, or that the networks Lawson found are descendants of an East German program. There is no evidence for any of that, and inventing a lineage would be exactly the kind of leap this series refuses. The claim is narrower, and it is about method, not about ancestry. What the precedent gives us is a template, a verified way of destroying a person through coordinated, deniable, institutionally mediated harm, and contemporary accounts map onto it closely enough that the comparison is serious rather than rhetorical. 3 explanations remain open. Continuity, meaning something never stopped. Diffusion, meaning the methods were copied. Or independent reinvention, because cruelty converges on what works. Choosing between them requires investigation. Here, honestly, the evidence runs out. One caution before we move on, and the knowledge base makes it. Once a template this vivid is public, it also shapes how people read ordinary trouble. That cuts both ways, and an honest investigator holds both. What the German record proves is that Lawson was not describing an impossibility. What it cannot do is prove his case for him. So we turn to the legacy of those 12 years, and to what the field built on them. So the historical templates exist, documented and closed, and the question of whether today's reports descend from them stays open. We leave that question where it belongs, with investigators. What remains for this episode is narrower and harder. One man went inside, watched for 12 years, and wrote it down. 2 decades on, what has that record actually done to the field it entered? That is the legacy of David Lawson. 2 decades after terrorist stalking in America, and 15 years after the revised edition retitled Cause Stalking, Lawson's fieldwork remains the single most cited piece of independent evidence in this literature. Researchers reach for it. Advocates quote it. Targets pass it hand to hand. When someone asks whether anyone has ever actually watched these groups from the inside, the answer offered is almost always the same name, and it is his. One measure of legacy is vocabulary. Cause stalking is Lawson's coinage, and it now sits in the field's working language beside gang stalking and organized stalking, 3 names for one reported pattern. His first title gave the literature terrorist stalking. His informants gave it the notion of a group behaving like some sort of special community police. Words travel further than findings do, and they carry their assumptions with them. The knowledge base entry puts it carefully. Lawson, it says, is cited as one of the few investigators to have infiltrated stalking groups operating in parts of the United States and Canada. Read that sentence slowly. One of the few. not one of many. In a field that reports tens of thousands of affected people worldwide, the number of trained investigators who have gone in and come back with notes is countable on one hand. The assessment offered here cuts both ways at once. It is a testament to what one determined person can do with a scanner, patience, and 12 years. It is also an indictment of everyone who could have done better and did not. The same fact carries both readings. His work is still the strongest independent evidence the field possesses, and it is still, after all this time, essentially unreplicated by anybody. Here is where the framework strains. Earlier in this episode we met White's estimate that roughly 7 targets in 10 can identify no cause at all, no grievance, no campaign, no reason anyone would want them harassed. That estimate comes from self-report, not from measurement, and it should be held loosely. But even held loosely, it is the number that Lawsons' cause framework has to explain, and it does not. This is the hard line, and it is the line the legacy blurred. On one side, what Lawson watched. Crews, vehicles, radios, rotations, recruits convinced they were protecting their own streets. On the other, what he made of it. A cause behind each campaign, a motive you could name if you looked hard enough. The first column is evidence. The second is interpretation, and the field has too often read them as one. Adopted as fact rather than hypothesis, the cause framework quietly installs 3 assumptions. That every target was chosen for a reason. That the reason can be found if you dig. That the reason is local, a grievance in a neighborhood or a workplace. Each is reasonable on its own. Together they tell a person who can name nothing that they simply have not looked hard enough, which is cruel and probably wrong. Even the name does work. Stalking asserts in 2 words that there is a cause. Say it often enough and the assertion stops being visible as an assertion. White's correction is not that Lawson was lying or careless. It is that a term coined to describe the groups he happened to find has been carried across to every case in the literature, including the many it was never built to fit. The deeper legacy is not a set of findings at all. It is a challenge, and it is addressed to institutions, to police forces with budgets and warrants, to universities with research funding, to journalists with editors and lawyers behind them, to the oversight bodies that exist, on paper, to protect citizens from precisely this kind of harm. One unfunded man managed 12 years of fieldwork. They have produced no equivalent. Set the ledger out plainly. One private investigator, attached to a Florida detective agency, working what appears to have been spare time across roughly 12 years, traveling the United States and Canada. No grant, no institution, no research assistance, 2 self-published books. And, on the record available to us, not one independent replication in the quarter century since. Whatever else that is, it is a very thin evidence base for a phenomenon of this reported scale. The Lawson record does not close here. It runs forward through the rest of this work along 4 lines. Against the statistics, to see whether one investigator's tactics match what thousands of self-reports describe. Into the psychology of the recruit. Alongside the documented history, the FBI's counterintelligence program and the Stasi's Zersitzung. And finally into the open question of how a field builds evidence that institutions can no longer wave away. The strand that unsettles most is the second one. Lawson's recruits were not, by his account, professionals. They were ordinary people persuaded that they were protecting their community from someone dangerous. A later chapter asks what distinguishes a person who accepts that story from a person who refuses it. Which traits, which circumstances, which small pressures. That question has an uncomfortable edge because it is, in the end, a question about all of us. Eleanor White gets the last word on Lawson here, and she says both halves of it in one breath. His investigation, she writes, is a godsend for targets of organized stalking, but there are frankly some problems with his books. Godsend and problems. Not one or the other. That refusal to choose is the discipline this episode has tried to model, and it is harder than either uncritical praise or easy dismissal. Take the episode in one breath. A radio scanner picked up traffic that should not have been there, and it opened a door. 12 years of spare-time fieldwork followed across 2 countries, inside the groups themselves. What came back was a description of method. Vehicles, rotations, signals, and people who believed they were policing their own streets. What did not come back was a reliable account of who was directing them. Now the honest column. His books were self-published. They were never peer-reviewed, never subjected to a methods section, never audited by anyone with an interest in finding the holes. The underlying material, the notes, the recordings, the dates, has not been published for others to check. Nobody has repeated the work, and his interpretations are contested even by the advocates who rely on him. Here, plainly, the evidence runs out. Our anchors for this episode were these. Chapter 4 of Knowledge Targeting. Eleanor White's Organized Stalking, A Target's View, Knowledge Base number 765, and her summary of the Lawson findings within it. Lawson's own 2 books, Terrorist Stalking in America and Cause Stalking. Supporting entries came from the TI-1 Voice knowledge base. Every photograph is freely licensed, and the full image credits are in the companion article for this part. If this episode has described your life rather than a chapter in a book, you are not carrying it alone. TI-1 Voice is a platform built by targeted individuals for targeted individuals. An evidence library, a knowledge base of thousands of index documents, a community wall, and secure messaging. TI-TV carries this series and much more, around the clock. Both are free to join and free to leave. Links below. Next time we test him. Part 5, Statistical Dimensions of Organized Stalking, takes the tactics one investigator watched from the inside and lays them against what thousands of people report from the outside. Do the patterns match? Where the numbers agree with Lawson, his account gets stronger. Where they diverge, something in the picture is wrong, and working out precisely what is wrong is the whole point of the next episode. Thank you for giving 2 hours to something this hard to hold. If you take one thing from David Lawson, let it be the shape of his effort, patience, notes, and the discipline to say where his knowledge stopped. That is available to anyone, and it is what turns experience into a record. Look after yourself tonight. Rest if you can. And we will see you again in Part 5.